Hello, everybody. This is Michelle Ford and
Ronisha Jones.
And welcome to the main event with the Chattanooga Film Guild's podcast. And we are absolutely thrilled and delighted to have with us here Dagan Beckett.
Hello.
Welcome, Dagan.
Hello.
Hello.
We're so
Good to be here.
Happy to have you here.
Yes, absolutely. For those of you who don't know, shame on you, but we're happy you're listening. Dagan Beckett is an an Emmy Award Winning filmmaker.
Yes.
And it is such an honor to have you here with
Thank you.
us.
Thank
we
you.
appreciate you being here. So, how long have you been making films?
That's a very spiritual question you just asked me. I've been a storyteller my whole life. I started my career as a professional musician, and I did some touring with some bands, and I loved it. And then at some point in my career, I was just really exhausted of the late nights and the weekends, and so I decided to start my own video production empire, in my own mind. And then from then, it was a lot of corporate work, and then at some point, I just wanted to make a movie. And that was in 2019, 2020. COVID had hit, and there was a lot of stories to tell. And so I jumped in, and it's been running ever since. So that was Songbirds, my first film.
Right.
And then we did Beautiful Faces after that. And then following that, we did Legacy America. We just finished that this about a week or two ago, actually. And then we're halfway through filming our fourth film, a rock doc called Sadowski, about a guitar builder. So yeah, it's just been full steam ahead for about 5 years now.
Okay, so let me get this straight. Your first film was Songbirds.
Yes.
And you won an Emmy.
Yes.
Okay, wait. I'm sorry. Let me repeat that. You made one film, and you won an Emmy.
That's what they say.
I also want to know, you filmed this in like 2 weeks, was it? Correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, yes and no. So, okay, with Songbirds, like most of us, I was real devastated. We were devastated about all the losses we were having, whether they were personal or business losses. And I was online, I was on Facebook, and I saw the announcement that the museum was closing. And for me as a musician, I would always go to Songbirds, and because I wasn't playing professionally anymore, I would go and I would just video bands, and I would give the bands that footage. That was my way of giving back to my local Chattanooga artistic community. And then I would get invited to shoot some of the more higher-end bands that would go, and then I developed a rapport with the staff and the team at the museum, and I really fell in love with that place. And then when I saw the announcement that they were closing, I was just devastated. And so I called Johnny Smith, who was the president at the time, and I said, listen, I don't know what I want to do, but I want to film something. Is there any way I could come in and film? And he said, well, I got good news and bad news for you. The good news is you can have as much access behind the scenes VIP as you want. But the bad news is you have 3 days to do it.
Oh, wow, 3 days.
You have 3 days to do it. I said, okay. So I called my crew up and I said, listen, guys, I don't have any money. Can you come and hang out with me for 3 days and film this museum? And they all just rallied. I didn't even have to finish my sentences, and my crew happily came and helped me. And we spent a day shooting nothing but interviews and talking heads. And then we spent 2 other days filming every nook and cranny, every inch of that museum, every guitar that they had. And it was a lot. And then I spent the next 2-3 months putting together an edit. And then I showed Irv, my producer, that edit, and he loved it. And then from then on out, and I guess that was probably the week or 2 week you were talking about. From then on out, we really figured out what holes we needed to fill with some of the artists. And we were very fortunate that we had some funding come in, and we were able to travel a little bit and film some really great artists like Joe Bonamassa, and we were fortunate to have people like Vince Gill in our film, and John Five, Marty Stewart, John Schneider, and And it was just a great opportunity to really have them tell their story of what Songbirds did for them as artists. And so that process was about a year, and then we were in production. And then we went to the film festival circuit. It did really well in the film festival. And because I was a member, I'm still a member of the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, I just, on a whim, said, because I'd always judged other films, and I said, well, let me just enter mine and see what that's like. And then we picked up an Emmy nomination, and then 3 months later, we picked up the win, and it's been full steam ahead. So that process was about a 2-year process, from the phone call I made at the beginning to the Emmy and send it to distribution.
That's awesome.
That's amazing.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
If you're exhausted hearing that, that's how I felt
can
after
only
2 years.
imagine.
Yes, but it sounds like it's because you used when I asked you the question, you said that's a spiritual question.
Yeah.
So it sounds like finding these stories and figuring out how to get them out to people, is that like a deeply spiritual thing to you?
Very much, as a documentary filmmaker, that's much different than when you're filming a narrative. And Michelle, you know narrative filmmaking. And actually, I take that back. I don't think it's all that different. When I pick up a story for a documentary film, you eat, sleep, and shower with that story. And even after it distributes, that story is still part of your soul, and it always will be. You're at that point an expert at what that is. And so I'm very selective of what stories I want to tell, because I know I'm entering in a marriage with that story. Because I'm a musician, Songbirds was deeply personal for me. It was deeply. Our second film, Beautiful Faces, was more of a medical, mental health film. But at the time of that, I was unfortunately going through a divorce. And so I was dealing with a lot of grief. I was dealing with a lot of guilt. And I was able to cathartically get that out through that film, and able to tell a story about the subjects of that film on what grief and what guilt looks like. And so that was deeply personal for me to do that. And the same thing with Legacy America, and the same thing with Sadowski. Every bit of those films, there's something personal about those that is meaningful for me in my personal life. So yeah, and I think that's the same for narrative in your films. I mean, those are as a screenwriter, that's something that means something to you.
Right. Yeah, that's very true. I'm fascinated though, because you bring up the concept of the narrative film and the documentary film, because from a narrative standpoint, I start knowing what the full story is, before we make the film. I know exactly how it's going to unfold. So how do you approach a documentary film? How do you find the story?
Great question. So yeah, it's a very rigorous process, and the first thing you do when either you're approached with the story or you come up, however the story gets implanted into your mind, you have to do your research, your R&D, your research and development. For me, as putting my executive producer hat on, I have to decide if there's an audience for the film. Songbirds, there was an audience for the film. And our film we just finished, Legacy America, that actually concept was brought to me and was pitched to me. And I had to decide if there was an audience for that, and ultimately found that there was 2 large audiences for that film. And so then after that, you have to write your script or your screenplay for it. And just because it's a documentary doesn't mean you don't have to write a screenplay. You still do.
Okay.
After you finish all your research and you figure out who the players are, what journeys they've been on, then you have to build your story and put it in order. And then once you do that, then you have to figure out what that's going to cost. Again, as an executive producer, I've gotten to the place now to where I can look at a scene and I know how much that costs. Well, that scene's going to send us to New York. That's a $14,000 scene. Okay. Once you know, this scene's going to take us to Nashville for 3 days, that's a $6,000 scene. And then you build your budget, and then you go out and you fundraise, and then you raise as much money as you can within that budget. And then if you don't get the money that you budgeted for, then you start slashing, cutting scenes and stuff. You try not to do that. But it's very much a narrative process. When you get all the players, you realize what the story is. And for me as a storyteller, I always start at the end. And I start with where I want my audience to leave with. What message do I want them to leave with? And then once I figure that out, that's like the mountaintop. Then I'll reverse engineer my way to get them to that point. And I build the roller coaster, like I'm taking them up and down in the story to get them to the end, to that point there. And that's the fun part, is when you're writing the story, what detours can you send them on where they don't expect this or that ultimately leads them to the very end. And that's a fun process for me. That's my favorite process, is almost being sneaky like that and kind of sneaking in things that they don't expect and stuff. And that's because, yes, we're storytellers, but we're also content providers. And the thing that we're competing for now in 2025 is not other filmmakers, not other films. We're competing with time and people's time. And when they take the moment to invest their time on my film, I want that to be worth their while. I want that investment to be worth their investment of time. And so I'm very conscious of my audience, who's the audience, and playing to their needs. It's almost fan service. If I'm, we just finished a film on the legacy of the steam engine train and the railroad. It's called A Portrait of the American Railway.
Yes.
So I know that my audience are going to be all the railroad people, and there are thousands of those people. So I want to make sure that when they're watching that film, they're literally in for a ride, no pun intended, on that, and it's worth their time.
Yes.
Same thing with Songbirds. When I did Songbirds as a storyteller and I wrote that, I wanted to make sure that my guitar geeks, and I'm talking about myself, got something out of it, but I also wanted to make sure that if you weren't a guitar geek, that there was something in there for you, and that there was a story that you could get out of when you walked away from that film.
Right.
And so that's important for me in crafting the story together, that there's something for everybody, even if you're not an expert in whatever field that the subject is about.
Yeah. I have a kind of deep question for
Sure.
you, Dagan. I wanted to ask you, as a storyteller, how important is it to document the story of those that have been silenced or erased?
That's very important to me. In our film Legacy America, that's exactly what we do in that. And I'll try not to spoil that. And again, that film, we literally just finished post-production and scoring on that about 2 weeks ago. And, that film is about the history and the legacy of the American Railway, and then where we're going in the future with passenger rail. But within the confines of that story, we focus on a people group, specifically persons with autism.
Okay.
That a lot of times they're just kind of stereotyped, and they're just kind of like pushed away as maybe they're weird or they're different. And so we really took a lot of time to speak to that group and really figure out what it is about the trains that they loved. They really persons with autism, they have these fixations, and they fixate on things. And sometimes it's Legos, sometimes it can be, space or video games, and trains is a big one. And so instead of, telling a feature-length film on, our trains were built in 18 blah, 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 and that's fun for the history buffs, but we wanted to see what the effect of that was on your everyday average person, specifically, not that they're everyday average person, your person with autism. So that film features a friend of ours named Rhett, who has autism, and he takes you through the journey of the train through his eyes. And that was important for us to highlight that him and represent people with autism, because, like I said, what we found in our research and our, educating ourselves on autism is that that's a group of people that is stereotyped and just kind of pushed away. And that's important for me. And Beautiful Faces, our first film, was the same thing. We talk with a mother who has an extreme sense of guilt and grief, and people just kind of rub off mental health as like, just just get better, just be better, and it's not that easy.
Right, of course.
You can't, So that to answer the long way around answering your question is, I think that's at the heart of every film we talk about, and so that's important.
So when you say this is at the heart of every film, is it something you already know starting out, or as you have an idea like about the trains? Is it something you discover along the way?
Yes and no. A lot of it is, when you do documentary films, 9 times out of 10, your film's going to take a different direction you never saw coming.
Of course.
That's just the way it is. With Legacy America, I had always had in the back of my mind, because I noticed like when we were filming the trains, there were these people who would just stand like really close to the trains. It's almost concerning, like you're really close to these trains, but they knew everything there was to know about these trains, and they were being safe about it. And I was just really curious, who are these people? And that's when I found out that it's, people with autism. They're just fixated on the trains, and so it's like, okay, I have to follow this.
Yeah.
This may not have been what we originally planned for, but we have to go down this route because that's a part of the story. If it's a part of the story, whether you scripted it or planned for it or not, if it's part of the story, you have to do it. I mean, that's just being authentic to your story, And sometimes, your story goes down those routes that you never knew were there, and it's wonderful when you find those, and you go and you do that, and you follow your instinct, and you tell those stories.
So do you have to, as you're weaving in something new that you never expected in the story, which I would imagine is thrilling, but do you have a hard time figuring out how to weave it in and what you might have to cut out
yes.
and sacrifice in order to put this new element in?
Yeah, again, to be transparent, I've never shot a narrative film, and so I don't know what that process looks like as far as cutting room floor. But with documentary, when you watch the hour-and-a-half film or the hour, however long it is, that's not even 1/3 of the footage that gets cut. I mean, you film for 2 years, and unfortunately, at the end of the day, you just have to make cuts, and it's so heartbreaking. There are stories that you just don't want to cut, and I learned that the hard way with Songbirds. We told this one story, and we had a very famous artist in it telling the story, but as a filmmaker and as a storyteller, the story that artist was telling had really nothing to do with the narrative we were on. And so I had to cut it.
Right.
And everybody's like, are you crazy? Why did you cut that? Why did you cut him? And I was like, it took you out of this flow of the story. So at the end of the day, it's all about the flow of the story. Mm-hmm. And when we find that thing that we want to tell, it has to be within that flow.
Right.
And 9 times out of 10, like when you get to that, you find that thing you didn't know was there, that story, it just enhances your overall story.
Right.
And then you cut out what you did have because, it wasn't really serving the purpose of the overall narrative. So,
Right.
yeah.
Well, in narrative filmmaking, we call that killing our darlings. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if I'm curious how this would compare to documentary filmmaking, but sometimes I'll cut a scene or a whole character out of a story, but then I'll put them on my shelf, my proverbial shelf, and use them later and write another script with them. Have you ever done that or thought about that, something you've cut and you're going to go back to it and make a whole separate film about it?
Not really, just because every film we do is just so completely different. However, a lot of the stuff we cut, like, we'll get to the end of the editing process and post-production, and then that's when we make our final cut. I mean, we do test screenings. I feel like I'm one of the only people in China that does test screenings. Maybe not. And we really figure out what we need to cut after that process, and we really figure out what we need to go back and refilm or film again to add to it. And a lot of times, those lost segments that we have, they'll magically make their way onto social media or on YouTube as kind of a fun behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And then that's it, you know. So
That's kind of cool.
yeah, nothing's ever really lost, you know. But unfortunately, it just doesn't make the final cut. With Legacy America, we had a poet in town who she wrote a beautiful poem, and we intended it for it to be in the film as part of one of the main songs that we had. But at the end of the day, it just wasn't working, and so we had to cut the film. We had to cut the song, but the song's going to be on our soundtrack.
Oh, great.
It just won't be on the film. So that's an example of, like, you hate to cut the stuff, and we always try to find a way to reuse it and maximize that, maximize people's time and effort. That's important for us. But for me, it's a product, and with that product, it's got to be, it's got to look as good as it can. It's got to sound as good. You got to honor your audience, and you got to take your ego out of it. You can't be a people pleaser. You know, you can't leave something just because somebody's going to be mad.
Right.
You got to look at the product, and I hate, you know. I hate saying a creative film or something is a product, but at the end of the day, it's called show business and not show art. You know, it's a business, and you want to make sure that, you know, you have the best product you can to get a return on that investment, because it is an investment.
Right.
People invest their time and money to make sure that they're proud of something that gets out, and you want to do them, you know, you want to do right by them.
Yeah.
As we're wrapping up, I'd love to ask you, who are some of the storytellers that influenced your journey?
Paul McCartney is
so
one of
cool.
them. Paul
So
McCartney
cool.
is. On the music end, it would be Paul McCartney, Hans Zimmer, Alan Silvestri, James Horner, those big composers. Eddie Van Halen is one of them. And then on the film end of it, Christopher Nolan is my favorite director. Of course, I'm a big Spielberg fan. I don't really watch a lot of documentaries, if I'm being honest. I watch music docs all the time. But, you know, I'm a fan of the 80s, my 80s movies, and yeah, I'll just watch those all day, like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate
that's
Factory.
one of my favorites. Yeah.
My favorite movies are all my favorite movies are sequel movies: Superman 2, Back to the Future 2, Star Trek 2, The Wrath of Khan, The Godfather Part 2. I don't know why that is.
I feel like there's something there that we could emotionally unpack, but that's for another podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The two, yeah. Well, Dagan, we appreciate you being here with us so much and
Thank you
giving
for
of your
having me.
time, not only to the podcast, but to the Chattanooga Filmmakers Guild. And we look forward to hearing more about your projects and everything that's going on.
Thank you. Thank you
Such
for
a
having me.
great gem here in Chattanooga, an Emmy Award winning filmmaker right here in our city, a film that was filmed right here in Chattanooga.
right.
We're so thankful to have you. You've just been a great contributor to filmmaking here and worldwide.
Well, and I just want to say real quick, I know you're wrapping up, but I'm very thankful to my Chattanooga hometown. You guys in Chattanooga have been amazing in supporting me and supporting my crew and sending us out amongst the country and parts of the world to film all these stories and then bring them back here in Chattanooga to put them together here and then send them back out into the world for everybody to see. And I'm very thankful and I'm so proud of Chattanooga. I'm so proud of everything we've done here, what Chattanooga has done, and I wave the Chattanooga flag everywhere I go, whether it's New York or LA or who knows wherever I'm at any one moment in time.
Awesome. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Dagan.
Great to
And
have you.
thanks for being a part of the Chattanooga Filmmakers Guild Main Event Podcast.
Thank you for having me.